The gentleman yields back. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. McCord. Good to see you. I listened very carefully to Mr. Higgins' questions, and I thought he hit the nail on the head in regards to the impact of energy policies on what's happening in Ukraine. And I just wondered if you agree with that. Do you agree that energy policies were in many ways are linked to what's happening in Ukraine?
I would say it's undeniable that the politics and the policies of energies are very important. I think if you look at Putin's history, he tends to make a move in winter when he knows that his Western European neighbors are probably most sensitive to his ability to cut off their natural gas or to threaten to do so, and that the revenue that he gets from oil is hugely important to his economy.
Yeah, thank you. The fact of the matter is, and I think eventually we will be moving to cleaner sources of energy, but the fact of the matter is today, the world uses about close to 100 million barrels of oil per day, and disrupting that supply would have devastating consequences in many ways across the world. Do you believe that whether or not our nation is energy independent is important for our future security?
It is.
Under the previous administration, it was widely seen that that we were, as a country, energy independent. Do you agree with that?
I am not an expert in this field. I don't know that we've ever been energy independent in the industrial era.
But do you agree that some of the first actions that President Biden has taken reduced our energy production and our energy independence?
A little bit outside my area of expertise. I couldn't comment on that.
Well, I mean, clearly he did. In the first week of his presidency, he stopped, he reduced production. He has slowed up the permitting for a new production of oil and gas, it makes no sense. Does that make any sense to you if a president is making those kind of decisions?
Well, I know that, for example, the Keystone Pipeline was a controversial decision under every administration over several years. So I think there was arguments on both sides.
But don't you think a president should be, at this point, particularly as we're seeing, and you already said you agree that energy is linked to what's happening in Ukraine, don't you think it would make sense for a president to do everything that he can to boost our production right now?
Well, there would be boosting production and boosting our climate resilience and boosting our electric vehicle and other. I mean, there's multiple ways you would want to attack this problem, I think.
You know, I think it's very difficult to look at the policies of this administration and not see how they are linked to what's happening in Ukraine. Even Zelensky and his advisors have said that our energy policies and policies of energy production in Europe have given the Putin the opening to do. He thought he had the leverage. We gave him leverage to do that. And then, as Mr. Higgins said, we helped to fund that war, fund what he's doing by continuing to buy oil from them. And then the other part of the energy policies, it has resulted in the inflation that we've seen today. And earlier this month, the House Armed Service, before the House Armed Services Committee, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley said this budget assumes an inflation rate of 2.2%, which is obviously now incorrect when we've seen inflation of 8.5%, far outpacing what was predicted in this budget. Why do you think the budget has missed the mark in so many ways in regards to rising prices?
Well, I want to distinguish the inflation rate in the 23 budget is for FY23, which hasn't started yet and won't end for a year and a half from now. So no one can conclude that we know that it's right or wrong. I would concede that inflation today is higher than what it was when we were locking the budget.
Yeah, so you agree that they were wrong in the predictions of the budget in regards to inflation? Yes, I would agree that anyone who predicts inflation in advance is going to be wrong, and I know that we're going to get more data. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, said back in 2010 that the most significant threat to our national security is our debt. At that point, our debt was $13.5 trillion, and now, as you know, it's over $30 trillion. one of the consequences of rising inflation that it's now forcing the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates, which also raises the cost for the U.S. to pay the interest on our debt. How do you think additional spending on interest, which will absolutely be required as a result of policies that have led to inflation, how will that additional spending affect and perhaps undermine our national defense?
Well, that would be a question that is, obviously primarily in your wheelhouse here in the Budget Committee as to how you would assess whether mandatory spending on debt is going to change your decisions on discretionary spending or discretionary spending caps, should caps exist. But it's an issue for all of us, and especially for those of you on the Budget Committee, as to whether the mandatory side, mandatory spending such as interest on the debt, is going to change what we think we can afford on the discretionary side.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCord, I'd just like to start by expressing my agreement with my colleague here and my shared concern for the impact of the deficit on our ability to provide for our national defense. And that is one of many reasons why I voted against the Trump tax cut that provided millions for millionaires at the expense of our national security and ballooned the deficit to epic proportions. I think that your budget here strikes the balance right. I agree with your top line. I think that the administration is finding a way to balance the needs of the military with also the importance of diplomacy. As a Marine veteran myself, I saw every single day in Iraq the impact that diplomacy had on saving the lives of our troops. I align myself strongly with Secretary Mattis, who, as Mr. Trump's Secretary of Defense, emphasized how important it is to fund our diplomatic establishment, our State Department, or else he said, you'll have to buy me more ammunition. Can you talk for a minute about how your budget supports our allies in Europe, meets the pacing threat with China, and balances all these things with the needs of the national security establishment today?
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. Let me start with China. As you know, we don't have the alliance framework of multilateralism in Asia that we do in Europe, so we continue to do a lot of bilateral work there. But we, in both theaters, we lead by example, and the investments that we're making in this budget are designed to keep us in an overmatched position versus China on the high end. I think a number of members have commented that what's happening in Ukraine obviously has lessons, depending how this comes out, for calculations that President Xi may make. We are very cognizant of that as well. In Europe, we've talked a little bit this morning about energy. I think that's a great example of sanctions, whether sanctions should extend to Russian energy and how much they should extend. There are something that you have to go together with your allies on. It doesn't work very well, obviously, sanctions that are unilateral. So I think that is something that is a good example of the steps that Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin have taken to move together has been enormously helpful in Europe. I think many of us, you may have better foresight than I. Many of us were surprised and heartened how responsive the Germans, for example, have been on Nord Stream and on their defense spending increase, things that I think would not have happened had we not taken the time to try and bring everybody together. So I think that, as you say, these how we do this is very important, and we've tried to move together with and lead the pack.
Well, the fact that the administration has been able to coalesce our allies around this mission is actually quite extraordinary. And of course, Trump was working at cross purposes to that every single day that he undermined NATO. Thinking about the future, when I co-led the bipartisan Future Defense Task Force, we spent a lot of time thinking about how the department can get the best equipment and newest technologies into the hands of the warfighter at the speed of relevance. That means they need to get the stuff today. We can't wait till it becomes outdated. Do you think the DOD acquisition system is efficient enough to address these challenges and compete with China?
I think that all of us are looking for a way that we can be more agile, but still be accountable and transparent enough. And your committee in the NDA created a PPB commission, so planning, programming, budgeting, and execution, which is the DOD-centric part of the larger federal budget process. That commission is now underway, co-chaired by a former comptroller and by a former AT&L or ANS executive.
That was my amendment, and I certainly hope it will be successful. I mean, one of our conclusions on the task force is that the system that we have today is not sufficient, that we have to reform it. But one of the other things we determined is that in the meantime, we can empower and reinforce the programs that are working. Deputy Secretary Hicks has openly discussed concerns with a shrinking defense industrial base, and the department has taken funding away from programs that are delivering critical capabilities, such as the Defense Innovation Unit. Now, DIU in particular has leveraged $25 billion in private R&D, introduced 100 new suppliers to DOD from 37 states in the face of a shrinking industrial base, and yet, shockingly, the department has cut its funding. So I agree with your top line, I agree with your strategy. I'm very proud of what the administration is doing in Ukraine, and yet I cannot understand why on earth you would cut the budget for DIU.
I'll have to get you a good answer for that one, Mr. Moulton.
Okay, well, I hope the answer is that we will restore
funding. I would
funding.
just say also that we have, as you know, Bill LaPlante just on board for a little more than a week, so we now have a full house in terms of our leadership in the acquisition and sustainment world to go along with Undersecretary Shue on the R&E side to help move us forward.
Well, I certainly hope it was just an oversight, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right, the gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to China and your assertion that this budget provides us with an overmatched position vis-a-vis China. According to China's Ministry of Finance, they've increased their defense spending by 7.1% this year. It's highest level since 2019. While we truly don't know what China spends on its military, it could be even higher. I think folks in the national security community are concerned about China's military ambitions. As you said, you consider China to be a threat on par with climate. Is that an accurate assessment of your judgment?
Yeah, I would say, and I would echo what Secretary Austin has said, we have threats that are very important that are not identical in nature. So COVID, for example, was a near-term threat to the health of our force and to the country. China is a longer-term threat, more of a military-centric threat. Climate is a more existential threat to our whole society. So they're important threats that are not identical threats.
So you're considering China a long-term threat. Let me quote the former commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Philip Davidson, who stressed that China might try to forcibly annex Taiwan before 2027. That timeline reflects China's massive investments in naval power and its recent expansion of nuclear weapons. Are you aware of a report to Congress in 2020 titled Military and Security Developments Involving the People's Republic of China?
Is this a Department of Defense report you're referring to? I believe there's an annual report that has been instituted in the last couple of years that I don't know if that's the title of it. It sounds like it's the same.
This is a regular report submitted for the last 20 years. The 2020 report states that China has already achieved parity with or even exceeded the United States in several military modernization areas, correct?
I don't have the report in front of me, but I don't dispute that it might have said that.
So you don't know which areas the report stated were of most concern?
I wasn't in the department in 2020, so I'm not familiar with the 2020 report.
Okay, the report states that China is ahead in the areas of shipbuilding, land-based conventional ballistic and cruise missiles, and integrated air defense systems. So do you think that a budget that would decommission 24 ships just this year while building 9 and projected that in the next 5 years our naval fleet would shrink further to only 280 ships, not meeting the legal requirement to field a fleet of 355 battleships, you think that would meet the needs of our position versus China?
That is exactly the intent, that the ships that the Navy proposes to decommission are ones that would not be capable in a high-end contest with China, whereas the ones that we're investing in would be.
All right, and at the same time, we're proposing to spend $3.1 billion on climate programs while cutting funding for ships, troops, and aircraft, $2 billion for climate resiliency at military installations, $247 million for operational energy and buying power, and $28 million for contingency preparedness. I would argue that this budget prioritizes Green New Deal initiatives over our military readiness vis-a-vis China, which, as I stated, is a near threat, not a long-term threat, as you earlier stated. Would you care to comment on that?
Sure. First of all, just on the climate side, the 0.5% that's in our budget for this does not detract from our military capabilities. These are investments that we need to make anyway. We're always going to be investing in our facilities, and we're always going to be investing in our vehicles, especially our non-combat vehicles. So we want to be investing in ones that are in the same direction the market is moving. With respect to China, again, China is a long-term threat or a now and future threat. So when I say long-term, I don't mean to the exclusion of they're not of concern today, just that they are going to be with us. They're going to be an influential economic power and influential military power for decades to come. So it is not a short-term issue. It is a longer-term issue. But that doesn't mean it's not already in the window of being a concern of ours. And I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear.
I appreciate that, and as you said, Chairman Xi is watching how we conduct ourselves in Ukraine and is prepared to act if we are not showing strength. So I believe a stronger military budget focused on ships would be appropriate and send the right message to the Chinese. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Undersecretary McCord, for your service to our country. Deeply appreciated. To my colleagues, I wish we were spending more within this budget on addressing climate change as a national security threat. I'm glad there's at least a little piece in here that recognizes that, because certainly it's extremely important. Mr. McCord, you probably know I'm not a fan of the ballooning Department of Defense budget. You probably know that I think there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse, and if the Pentagon were to undergo a comprehensive audit, as every other agency has done, that would make an enormous difference, and it might get me more interested in putting more money into the defense budget. But at this point, the Department of Defense budget has ballooned to $740 billion in 2022, more than double the defense spending in 2000. Our defense spending makes up about half of all federal discretionary spending, even as we question our ability to pay for critical investments like childcare or housing or things that families across the country need. But I want to dive into one of the factors driving that spending, and that is the statutory requirement that DOD provide an unfunded priorities list, a wish list of items that would be nice for DOD to have, but are not required to carry out its duties. This is on top of the $773 billion requested by the White House for fiscal 2023. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said last year that the president's budget request for fiscal 2022 met DOD requirements, and yet the law still requires DOD to provide this unfunded priorities list. And that's why I've persistently offered an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act to eliminate this wasteful practice. Mr. McCord, how does DOD determine what goes into the White House budget request versus the unfunded priorities list?
Well, thank you. The budget process is something that is led from the top down with input from the services up. And especially this year when we had a new strategy under development, we're looking at it all through the lens of what supports our strategy. So what goes in the budget are our highest priorities. I want to be clear about that. Nothing in an unfunded priority list is a higher priority than anything in our budget. So I know that they sometimes get misunderstood as somehow a service chief or a combat commander saying this is more important than what's in the budget. That is not the case. The law, as you said, I think they've been a practice for about 25 years, and they've been codified in law more recently than that. They are the opinions of senior military people. They are not vetted by civilians, including the secretary or myself or the service chiefs. So they are the best professional military advice. If of a particular senior officer, if in my area there were more funds, what would I choose to spend them on? But they should not be confused with saying that the budget is not adequate or that that things in the budget are less important than the things on those lists. But I think that they are easily misunderstood to be saying that they are must-haves that somehow trump the budget, which is not the case.
That is such an important explanation. These are just basically, wish I had this, nobody's really looked at it, we haven't looked at it in the context of the entire department. They're completely separate from the process that you go through as a department approved by the secretary to say these are the most important things that we need and must have. So in a June 2021 hearing before the Armed Services Committee, House Armed Services Committee, General Milley said of unfunded priorities, if they were critical, then they need to be higher on the priority list and in the base budget. Do you agree with that statement, Mr. McCord?
I do.
Thank you. And these unfunded priorities, again, are just a wish list that don't reflect the true needs of the United States. I understand that we're living in uncertain times with increasing global tensions because of the war in Ukraine. I think the president and his team have done a phenomenal job of really building a diplomatic coalition across the world. In response, Congress has authorized $1.35 billion in military assistance to Ukraine and $3.5 billion to the Defense Department to replenish its equipment stock. Is an unfunded priorities list even necessary to provide flexibility in military spending?
I would say the purpose of unfunded priority list is not generally about flexibility. It's about, in the opinion of a senior military person, that Congress, presumably by virtue of the legislation.
So the answer is no.
No.
No, the answer is no.
Flexibility is a process that we have to go through with the Congress, and Ukraine's a perfect example of how flexible the process can be when there's an emergent need that everybody agrees is important to address. The evacuation of Afghan interpreters was another one just in my time back in office. Our own process is sadly far less flexible, and we get our appropriation bills months late, every year.
Something I know the chairman has been making sure our side is not part of the problem here. But I thank you for that, Undersecretary, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentlewoman yields back, and now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Boebert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks again, Undersecretary McCord, for taking the time today to talk about Mr. Biden's defense budget proposal. Sadly, this budget is a continuation of the wokening and weakening of our military, and I wish I could say that I'm surprised, but I'm really not. Somehow we are spending more on defense than we ever have, but we're ignoring real national security threats like China, Iran, the complete invasion at our southern border with 2 million people coming into our country illegally, more than 2 million. So let's take a look at what Mr. Biden would like to spend this money on. Undersecretary McCord, would you say that this budget makes investments into making our military more green? Meaning, does this budget allocate funds to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
The investments that we have in our budget on climate resilience are not the primary metric is not greenhouse gas emissions. It's making us more climate resilient to the extreme weather events.
More green, electric vehicles and whatnot.
The electric vehicles part,
Okay.
yes. The installation part is not an emissions-based metric.
Thank you, Mr. Undersecretary. Mr. Biden has said that all federal agencies should be at net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Does this budget make investments towards getting there?
This budget makes investments in all of the president's priorities.
Okay, thank you.
There's a long time between now and 2050, so the
But
direct line is hard to
there
connect.
was a mission put in place by your commander-in-chief, and this budget certainly gets the ball rolling on that goal to be at net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This puts that plan by your commander-in-chief into action, correct?
We would want to be moving in that direction, but again,
Okay, thank you,
this
Mr.
budget doesn't
Undersecretary. Well,
extend
frankly,
anywhere near to 2050.
Mr. Undersecretary, it sounds to me like you're burning the tax dollars at the altar of environmental extremists, because in this report that I have here that I would like to seek unanimous consent to enter into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. This report issued by your agency is not, quote, technically feasible for the DOD to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, end quote. This is your report, and it provides an example of the impacts woke Green New Deal policies would have in action, saying, quote, the DOD cannot, for instance, risk an armored brigade in combat running out of fuel because it's only allowed to acquire net zero fuel and none is readily available, end quote. So, Mr. Undersecretary, why are we proposing to spend billions, and some estimates from this report say trillions of tax dollars towards reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions when the DOD has already said that this is not feasible?
Well, again, net zero as a policy for a country or an agency is one thing. Our budget is not a budget to 2050. We could not possibly predict what kind of vehicles or aircraft we're going to be using in 2050.
But you're certainly
Probably
setting
nothing in the
forward those
inventory
goals
today.
to reach that in 2050 when we know that it's not feasible. And I'm sorry to cut you off. My time is short here. According to this report, I mean, it says trillions of dollars, but instead of wasting our time and tax dollars on turning our military green, let's talk about what really should be focused on. Earlier this year, I joined my colleagues in sending a letter to Secretary Austin asking for the congressionally required report on U.S. equipment left in, destroyed, or removed from Afghanistan during the disastrous withdrawal. We sent this letter 2 weeks after it was already due to Congress, and we still have not received the complete report or virtually any accountability for the surrender and the total failure that was Afghanistan. Mr. Undersecretary, is the DOD aware of this congressional request for the way overdue report on the Afghanistan debacle?
On the issue of equipment that was left behind, my understanding that I know I've seen draft reports. I believe that those reports have been submitted, but there may have been different requests.
Can you tell me how many tanks are currently in Afghanistan?
No.
With all due respect, Mr. Undersecretary, I've asked for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and I'm kind of getting bread here. We don't have the full and complete answers that we need. This is a congressional mandate that we get this report. Can you tell me how many rifles are in Afghanistan? If there's been reports that have been made, can you tell me how many rifles are left behind?
I would have to get for the record for you the reports that I've seen.
Do you know how much U.S. military ammunition is left in Afghanistan at the hands of the Taliban?
I'm sorry, munitions?
Yes.
Again, I would have to refer you to the reports. I don't prepare those reports myself.
Do you know how many night vision gear, how much of our night vision equipment is left there? So, Mr. Undersecretary, the point that I'm getting at here is we can't tell the American taxpayers how we have spent their money, how we have funded and equipped the Taliban, and now we're asking for more money. Mr. Undersecretary, do you think that Congress deserves this report?
Gentlewoman's time has expired. And, but you're entitled to submit questions for the record.
Thank you very much. And may I also ask unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record? I apologize.
Yes.
I thought I had 39 seconds.
No, now you're over 30.
I see that.
Now, without objection, you may submit that for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I want to thank Undersecretary McCord and all of the leadership with the Department of Defense, and particularly our service members and their family members for their service every single day in protecting our national security. Too often in these hearings, we tend to get wound up in partisan talking points, and for some reason, we don't focus on the very people that we are here to pass a budget to serve, and that's the American people. And in this case, our service members who need the resources to be successful when they need it. So I'm sure I don't have to remind Undersecretary McCord, Department of Defense acquisition and modernization programs take years of planning and development. They require consistent and reliable funding in follow-on years to meet the needs of warfighters. Funding for our national defense is not some political prop that can be held up to score cheap political points. And yet, for all the bluster that we're hearing from some of my colleagues about the DOD's top line, it was their side of the aisle that held up the omnibus spending package for fiscal year 22 for nearly 6 months. They delayed putting critical, important, major acquisition programs at risk, prevented new programs from starting, and delayed pay raises for service members. Additionally, they degraded readiness at an extremely dangerous moment. And for the record, Joe Biden is the commander-in-chief. And when our allies needed us most, he's the one who helped to bring them together to make sure that we're holding Russia accountable. Inconsistent funding emboldens our adversaries and undermines the trust of our allies, a trust that we have had to fight hard to restore after the previous administration. So I want to be clear that the tactics are not just partisan ploys. They have real life effects for my district, for my constituents, and for service members around the world. Now, last year, I supported an increased top line for DOD spending. And this year, like every year, I will work hard in a nonpartisan way to ensure that the capabilities and systems included in the Pentagon's budget request are reviewed. Only after a careful assessment of the threat environment and our capabilities can we decide if an increase is again necessary to meet the complex challenges of our ever-evolving strategic environment. Undersecretary McCord, in my previous discussion with Department of Defense leaders, they have stressed to me that continuing resolutions do far more damage to readiness and the well-being of our service members than any of the hollow complaints we've heard here today. Could you please speak to the impacts that CRs have on military readiness and the importance of consistent funding for our most critical modernization programs?
Thank you for that question. Yes, this is something I think that is not well understood, and it's been hard to translate to the public because the organism that is the Department of Defense has adapted to perpetual CRs in a way that therefore you don't see contracts expiring because nobody tries to write a contract in the first quarter of a fiscal year anymore because they know that you're going to be under a CR and not going to be able to enter into new contracts. So there's the issue, first of all, of delayed resources, especially when there's inflation, but even when there's not, time is money, and when we lose time, we lose the ability to be agile, we lose resources. This year was particularly bad, as you say. It's sort of the threat to have a full year CR, which has never happened to the Department of Defense in history, was particularly troublesome to us, and we had a hearing. I had a hearing with the service chiefs before the House Appropriations Committee that spoke to this issue in some detail in January to lay out the problems. As you may know, we had a history beginning with sort of the fall of the Berlin Wall for about 20 years where the Department of Defense Appropriations Bill got enacted on average about 25 days into the fiscal year, which is reasonable. But beginning with the threat of default in 2011 that led to the Budget Control Act, and continuing since that day, that average has ballooned to 120 days into the fiscal year on average over the last dozen years, compared to 25 days for the 20 years before that. So we have definitely gotten into a bad pattern that needs to be broken. It does cost money. It does make us less agile when a number of members have pointed out that China does move fast, and we need to be able to, we can't afford to give away 3, 4, 5 months of a fiscal year every year to our adversaries by hamstringing ourselves.
Thank you. I know my time's expired. I just hope that all of us can come together and make sure that America succeeds by helping our service members and their families in this budget. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Mr. Secretary, your former boss, Defense Secretary Robert Gates, said a few years ago that President Biden, quote, has been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades, end quote. Even former President Obama tried to warn people during the 2020 campaign, and he said, don't underestimate Joe's ability to screw things up. Americans seem to agree, as a Gallup poll in February showed, that only 40% of Americans approve of the way President Biden is handling foreign policy affairs, and only 36% approve of the way he's handling specifically the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think this budget is further proof of this administration's misguided priorities. Would you say that Americans are safer today than they were in January of 2021?
I would.
On what basis?
I think we have strengthened our alliances, and I think the unified response that we've seen in Europe to Russian aggression has shown kind of a revitalized Western response of democracies.
If I may,
you wouldn't have seen the Germans.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you. Thank you for claiming my time. Can you explain why the Department of Defense wants to spend $3.1 billion on climate programs, or 4 times what the $682 million allocated for Ukraine? So $3.1 billion on climate programs in this budget, which is more than 4 times the $682 million allocated for Ukraine.
First, I would say that we are in this fiscal year spending more than that on Ukraine, and we are about to ask for another supplemental to increase to make sure that the Ukrainians have what they need to continue the fight.
From a military standpoint, what's the $3.1 billion for on climate programs?
That is both on that has 2 basic parts. It's the installation side, our facilities, our buildings, our bases, and then there's
how does investing in climate programs help military preparedness, military readiness, military effectiveness?
Well, on the facility side and resilience, it's to be better prepared for extreme weather events, which are increasing in frequency. On the vehicle side, the idea is to reduce our logistics footprints to have more capability to be not tethered to a logistic train of fuel in all cases.
This president,
and to move where the market is going.
Thank you. This president told our troops, of all people, our troops back in June, that the greatest threat to America is climate change. He even added his typical, "This is not a joke." I guess he needed to add the, "Hey, this is not a joke," because the soldiers were probably, I have to presume, surprised to hear from the commander-in-chief that the greatest threat to the country, and telling them as military personnel that the greatest threat is climate change. And then just last week, and you've kind of alluded to it already, the president stated that we're going to spend billions making every military vehicle climate friendly. I think that makes us the amusement of our adversaries around the world, that's what we're focused on. It's as embarrassing as it was to send John Kerry to essentially beg the Russians to consider the climate impact of the invasion if they were going to do that just before the invasion took place, even days before. But the president said, quote, "Every vehicle is going to be climate friendly. Every vehicle. I mean it. We're spending billions of dollars to do it." Do you think that climate concern should be the main priority for our military vehicles?
It is not the primary concern. Their effectiveness is. But
well, the president said that we're going to spend billions to do that. This budget, switching gears to another topic, contains $34 million to address, quote, "concerning behaviors and extremism." What does this mean? What's the purpose of that funding?
As Secretary Austin has stated, the incidence of extremism in the military is low, but any amount is not acceptable, and so these efforts.
Well, I want to interject there on Secretary Austin. I'm glad you brought him up because he said when we were asked to give an exception to approve him in the House because he didn't meet the 7 years of required retirement between military and civilian service, he said that his self-proclaimed mission essentially was to root out racism in the military. Is that truly a significant problem? I mean, for him to say that's one of the reasons why he was there, to root out racism in the military, it seems to me the military has been an example of integration of merit-based performance and advancement, as evidenced by Secretary Austin and Secretary Powell before him on the Secretary of State side. Is this truly a significant problem for our heroes in the military?
Well, I would say, first of all, racism exists in society. It exists in every institution.
They were to spend $34 million to address it in the military.
But racism and extremism are 2 different topics, and I think you were citing a figure about addressing extremism. Racism is a different issue, and I would certainly say Secretary Austin probably has more experience with this issue than I do, and so I certainly would not question his.
All right, well, my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize another gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCord, in the Reagan administration, we were talking about a 600-ship Navy. Without getting into classified information, can you tell us what size Navy we could expect if this budget is approved? and how that compares to the size of other nations' navies?
Mr. Scott, I would say that our Navy, and a 30-year shipbuilding report was just sent to Congress, so you can look at different periods of years out to, several decades out in the future, but we're in the 300 ship range right now. We were not in the 600 ship range before. There was talk of a 600 ship Navy, not the reality of a 600 ship Navy before, but we are looking to have a very capable force, the most capable Navy in the world by far, at about 300 ships.
And how does that compare to the size of navies of other countries?
I don't have the figures of all the navies around the world at my fingertips. We can get you.
The top
It is the
ones,
most capable Navy in the world.
If we're going to build ships, you have to maintain them. What are we doing to upgrade the ship repair facilities at public yards? How is that coming?
Well, we have some major investments in our shipyard capability, primarily on the submarine side. You're probably familiar with the so-called SIOP, S-I-O-P, a Navy acronym for a shipyard investment plan. That's basically a 20-year plan, $20 billion 20-year plan for the 4 public shipyards that have not been seen the kind of maintenance they need for a century. And so these are addressing our ability primarily to take care of our nuclear force. In addition, we have investments in the submarine workforce, those are probably the primary ship investments we have, is to keep our submarine industrial base and our submarine yard and our shipyards capable of moving through this period where we're buying both Columbia and the Virginia class at the same time, which puts some additional stress on that part of our industrial base.
And what kind of priority is made to make sure that the private repair yards get enough work to stay in business?
Well, on the private repair yards,
and minority-owned shipyards.
Yes, sir. The private yards, as you know, focus much more on the surface side, and there I think one of the best things we can do is have stable, predictable funding, getting to the point of the previous question about perpetual continuing resolutions. Stable, predictable funding will be a great benefit to the private sector yards because they have always, as you know, have always had to be more flexible than the public yards because they flex up and down when funding is unpredictable. So that I think is probably the best thing we can do. In addition, we need to get our private sector yards producing the ships on time. So we have been putting more money into, say, buying destroyers at 2 a year, but they're not able to produce 2 a year. That leads to all kinds of problems in terms of maintenance cycles if you can't get the ships out of the yard. And we all know that the ship industrial base, shipyard workers are one of the areas that has been a supply-demand issue right now in terms of getting the skilled workers you need. Is a big challenge for the Navy.
Is the Army Corps of Engineers budget in your portfolio?
It is not. The Army Corps of Engineers is part of the department, but their budget is on the civil side and does not come through me.
If you fail to do, we've had disparaging remarks made about climate change. If you fail to invest in resilience to protect against sea level rise, what will happen to military assets like the Naval Station at Norfolk?
Well, that is one of the things that concerns us, is the Navy and the Marine Corps particularly are vulnerable to the impacts of extreme weather and sea change. We alone as the Department of Defense, to be clear, cannot prevent climate change, and we are not attempting to prevent it by ourselves. We are trying to be responsive to it and look ahead and get out ahead of changes so that our installations are more capable of dealing with these events and doing what we can to be part of the solution, but we are not going to solve the problem by ourselves.
And I introduced legislation that was signed into law as part of the recent NDAA to allow mitigation of stormwater flooding around military bases. How is that going to be implemented?
Mr. Scott, I would have to get you that for the record from our installations community. I can't speak to that from my own expertise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary McCord, I'd like to continue a line of questioning regarding inflation. Obviously, that's been front of mind for many members of Congress, and I mentioned in the Department of Defense as well. In your testimony, you mentioned that in preparing the budget, you used a chain-weighted inflation index as a benchmark rather than consumer price index. Can you talk a little bit more about the assumptions that were made in preparing the budget and what rate of inflation for the chain-weighted price index that you're assuming?
Yes, sir. The reason that we use the rate that we use is that it is, first of all, in U.S. code, that's what we're supposed to be using, but also because of the biggest single category of what we do is purchases of goods and services from the private sector, and that's a pretty good metric for a GDP deflator to measure.
Sure. So what number did you use in preparing the budget?
For the budget, for what we did was the FY20, if I can walk one step back, the FY22 budget was prepared assuming about 2.2% inflation for the year that we're in now. What we did was we looked at the data, it had doubled to 4 by the time we were wrapping up our assumptions in December. So we built that price increase into our budget for 23. So based on what was happening in the calendar year that just ended, calendar year 21. For the budget for FY23, we use, like as with every administration, OMB produces one set of economic assumptions that every agency uses. That inflation rate is 2.2%. And so the question that has been discussed this morning and in other venues is whether that's the right assumption for the fiscal year that's going to start this September, based on the fact that it's higher than that right now. But we don't get to decide what to use for 23. We use consistent assumptions across an administration, as every administration does. For 22, we did our best working with OMB and working with the president to up our price basing across this 5 years so that we were not falling behind on what was happening last year. But the situation has continued to change, as most primarily, again, the spike in energy prices since the Russian invasion of Ukraine was something that is not in our budget, could not have been in our budget. We were already done with our budget by then. So this remains something we need to work with the
Sure.
Congress on.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you said that you were prepared to work with Congress to address those impacts. On a historical basis, if you look at our investment in the Department of Defense in real dollars, how do we compare historically right now to where we've been in the past?
We're at a relatively high level, especially when you consider the number of people in our force is smaller. So we have a smaller, highly compensated force, which has been true for a number of years and is true today. So okay. we're on somewhat the higher end. And of course, you could always have debates with people about, do you take the cost of something like Iraq or Afghanistan, do you include those or do you exclude those as unique events? But our budget is on the high side in real terms right now.
Okay, so I've seen other measures that disagree with that assessment. And I don't think it's fair to measure it in terms of the number of people in our armed forces, because as you have described, the number of people is declining, but our need for a robust Department of Defense is certainly still very high. And I'm concerned that we can't fall behind the curve there on a real dollar basis. But with the time I have left, I wanted to ask about something on a different topic. So I understand that there's been a debate in the Department of Defense about a change in philosophy from a counterinsurgency point of view towards more of a response to near peers like Russia and China, as geopolitical events have shifted in the last few years. I represent some of the largest training bases in the country. I'm honored to represent Fort Irwin, the Marine Air-to-Ground Training Center in 29 Palms. Does this budget make the necessary investments to shift our training philosophy in response to this shift in DOD philosophy from counterinsurgency to near peer?
I would say that's the intent, but certainly our Army and Marine Corps leadership could probably give you better, and you probably already have better specific information about the combat training centers and how they're adapting. But yes, we are trying to move our focus of both our modernization and our training to the near peer or high-end competitions, exactly as you said.
All right. Well, thank you. I see my time's expired. I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back, and now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes. He's not, is he virtual? Is he not? Okay, I'm sorry. I skipped my friend, Mr. Grothman. Now you have 5 minutes, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Thank you very much. Looking through some articles about your department, I notice here's an article that was written last week, and the plan is to decommission 2 littoral combat ships. They were kind of big ships. I think those ships are about 100 yards long. Big stuff. I've seen them. One was built in, I believe, 2015, and one was built in 2016. So these are rather large ships. I'm sure very expensive to build an over 100-yard ship. And we plan on declassifying them less than 10 years in. I'm glad you're doing it if it's a waste of money. Do you have any comments on how that could happen? How we could build a big ship and 10 years later we want to scrap it?
Thank you. Yeah, the issue with those particular ships is that first of all, that as the strategies have focused more, as was just discussed, toward the high-end peer competitors, both the Mattis strategy and Secretary Austin's strategy, these ships are not as consistent with these new strategies that focus on a high-end fight against a very capable military like China. Secondarily, on the littoral combat ships, several of them, the mission packages for these ships never delivered in a correct and usable form. So the ships basically do not have the capability they were supposed to have, even on top of the question of whether that's the right capability for the future.
Okay, would you say it's accurate if I say we wasted money building the USS Jackson and the USS Montgomery?
The littoral combat ships that we are decommissioning, I would say were not our best use of funds.
Okay, so I think a goal we should have is to make sure we don't make any more mistakes like these 2 big 100-yard ships that we're decommissioning almost right after they were built. Do you think they were built, well, I don't know at the time, were they things that were built because of pressure from Congress when the Navy didn't want them that much in their own right?
I think at the time there was a desire to have ships that would be more agile for a wider range of missions that maybe wouldn't be so much on the high end. But again, as the strategies have shifted to we do want to focus on the high end, they have a bit of a strategic mismatch, and then there's a particular problem of these ships' mission packages did not deliver.
Yep. I'm afraid we don't have enough missile defense, enough cyber defense. I think there are things that we aren't looking at because to a degree, we may be fighting the last war, or maybe going back about 6 wars, 5 wars. I remember reading about, the Battle of the Midway in World War II, and at the time, some people felt it showed that aircraft carriers were overrated, and that was proven in 1941. Was it 42? 42. Battle of the Midway was 42. Okay, now I've had people tell me that aircraft carriers, well, there is nothing more beautiful and impressive looking than an aircraft carrier. Against a country like China or North Korea, in war games, they may last a day or 2 days. Are there smart people who believe that against a country like Russia or China or North Korea, an aircraft carrier may only last 1 or 2 days?
I would say that there absolutely are analysts who believe that carriers have questionable survivability in a high-end fight, and the Navy would strongly dispute that. So that is something you could have an entire good classified debate on. There are definitely people who believe as you state.
Yeah, I run into them, and it kind of bothers me because I think we're short of missile defense and short of cyber defense, and we keep these big aircraft carrier groups out here. And like I said, it was a very different time, but we were able to sink some Japanese aircraft carriers very quickly in 1942, and they do, compared to missiles, are very slow. And
I would also say that the Navy would say that compared to a base on land that can't move at all, carriers are much more agile than any other way to project power. So again, there are some different...
I've heard that argument that by that standard, nothing is worthwhile, right? not only would they sink an aircraft carrier right away, they destroyed an Air Force base right away. But do you feel in your heart that if we went to 10 aircraft carriers or 9 aircraft carriers and used that money for missile defense or cyber defense, we would be more in tune with the times if our real goal is to protect the United States of America?
What we tried to do in this budget, and gets exactly to the point that you're doing, is try and address our challenges on a number of fronts and not say we can only do a maritime threat or only do missile defense or only do cyber. We tried to put chips on a number of places we wanted to put bets. I think it's a continuing question what the future of surface warfare is. Certainly the movement in the maritime world is more toward moving eventually toward unmanned, moving toward more distributed sets of naval architecture. But we are, it's not at the expense of missile defense. Missile defense tends to be, if anything, technologically limited, of what is technologically capable to be done as quickly as you'd like it to be done, rather than funding constrained.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank the chairman for indulging me. I'll point out if one of those aircraft carriers gets sunk, in addition to the huge waste of money, there are 5,000 people on each of them who die. So whether you want to take that into account, I don't know, but thank you for giving me.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Thanks the Undersecretary for being here today. Mr. Undersecretary, you're familiar with the position of the comptroller at the Pentagon. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. This is my second time. I've been back since the 1st of June, and I served in the position previously.
So for several years, I've tried to get the Pentagon to audit, as every agency was required to do, 20 years ago, and to get the audit undertaken at the Pentagon. I think fiscal year 2018, the first audit was finally undertaken. No great surprise, it wasn't passed. And what we have been told is that by 2027, the clean audit will in fact be done. Is that still, that's 4 years from now, is that still the glide path that you're envisioning for the clean audit for the Pentagon?
I think that is still the best estimate that we have, yes.
Are you able to implement any improvements of problems that you find along the way? Like in a business, there'd be continuous quality improvement in any lean manufacturing process. Are you able to incorporate any of those things as you're encountering them?
Yes, the main things that we're trying to focus on are the systems controls, and probably the hardest thing that we have to do is trying to get rid of older systems that we still rely on every day to do our many business processes. But yes, we are implementing control. We are implementing as we go. We are finding that some of the notices we get from our auditors are now more complex than the first round or two. So they're not easy. They're more difficult to get through. But we are making progress, but it is not fast enough.
Sure. Well, I want you to continue to keep a focus on that. Let me just ask you also, in the process of working on the NDAA several years ago, in 2020, severe problems with base housing were uncovered. The privatization of base housing that occurred back in the 1990s, trying to offload that appropriation from the Department of Defense and farming it out. 20 years later, 30 years later, some of those properties now are suffering, and maintenance has been deferred. So NBC News is reporting on the Senate report from the Senate Homeland Security Committee that of the problems that still exist in base housing. So can you do anything to assure us that that is still a high priority for the Pentagon to bring that base housing up to standard?
Yes, sir. I'm familiar with. I read a report of the hearing that you described on the Senate side this week, and I would say that while not directly under my purview, we do have a nominee pending that would really own that responsibility. The Tenant Bill of Rights, which I'm sure you're familiar with in the NDAA, I would say if it is not proving, if there's enough time to determine that it still needs further improvement, then that is something the department should work with the Congress on. I know that it had, I believe, over 30 different aspects to it, some of which may not have been completely rolled in yet. But as you described, I remember when housing privatization started, it was always a bit of, it was a, by Pentagon standards, it was a bold move into privatization, and the rubber was always going to meet the road, not up front when the houses were being built, but later on into the middle of the deals, which is where we are now. And I think it is important that we work with the Congress to make sure that we stay on top of this within the realm of things that are privatized, and having DOD have its appropriate share of responsibility, and the contractor having theirs.
I'm just going to have to reclaim my time because I'm going to run out. Let me just ask you: we're going to be asked to provide a good deal more in the way of military assistance to Ukraine. They've got a terrible problem, and it's horrifying what is going on over there. But can you share with us, does the administration kind of have an overarching strategy about where they are going with this? We keep hearing about Stinger missiles going over. We keep hearing about Javelin missiles going over. Are these coming from our existing stock? Are we replacing those? How is that all working together right now?
Yeah, thank you for that question. What we have done is worked in concert with our allies. So there's about 30 countries that are helping Ukraine. So it's not all on us to help them, although we are, as is often the case, leading the coalition and leading the effort. Yes, we are donating from our own stocks. We are also looking to find from any place that we can. Secretary Austin and General Milley spend basically part of every day on the phone with people from other countries trying to get them to contribute as well, especially Russian-type equipment that Ukrainians are more familiar with. So there is both the U.S. side of equipment, U.S. NATO standard equipment that's being delivered to them, and especially from Eastern European countries that have more familiarity with it, Russian-style ammunition and equipment. So we're doing both. We have done 8 drawdown packages, 8 packages where we have drawn down our own supplies and given to Ukraine. Congress gave us funding to replenish those, and we have sent out 2 notices so far. So we've sent about $3.2 billion out the door. We have started the clock on $2 billion of that to start replenishing our own, get our industrial base spent up to start replenishing those missiles for ourselves. But we are now to the point of expending all of the authority Congress gave us in the Ukraine supplemental attached to the omnibus appropriations bill from 6 weeks ago. And we anticipate sending another supplemental to Congress probably this week to continue to show that we are in this with the Ukrainians to get them what they need to fight, to continue the fight to defend themselves. So I think the overall message is we are not letting up on the gas. The Ukrainians are fighting hard for their own country. We want to continue to do what we can to support them.
Yeah, we'd love to see the strategy, though, that the administration is pursuing. Right now, it just seems as a need comes up, we fill it. As a need comes up, we fill it. But where are we going? Where is this going to end up? Right. Because remember, it was these folks that
gentleman's time has long expired.
underestimated the resiliency and the resolve of the Ukrainian people. Everyone said it would be over in 3 days. Well, it wasn't. And I can't believe that the geniuses in charge couldn't anticipate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jacobs.